I'm Raul, Navarro. I'm from Mexico, but I live in Barcelona and I study my PhD there. And I will try to present my work or what I'm doing nowadays with my PhD. And I apologize for my lovely Mexican English accent, but and then maybe I prepared this to try to be more easy to follow the presentation. The title of my presentation is Poetry and Pedagogy in Classical Greece, Approach to the Dispute of the Monopoly of Education. This research project is focused on the relationship between poetry and education. Its context reveals the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy in classical Greek period, 5 and 4 centuries before Christ. Also necessary to note that this study considers the phenomenon from the pedagogical point of view. This research is focused on the notion of poetry because his main challenge is to know if poetry has something to do with education, and also if it's possible to extract some pedagogical possibilities and project them to the critical time that we are living nowadays. Almost 25 centuries sounds so far away, but this was exactly this decisive period where poetry was relegated to philosophy as educative element and activity. What I'm trying to say is that in this period were a strong dispute between two different ideas of education, and on one hand there was a school of the body, like a physical education, and on the other hand had a new intellectual education that was introduced by the Sophists. In my own perspective, this work doesn't try to recover a kind of ideal past where poetry was useful and central point of citizens' education. Nevertheless, I think that nowadays poetry could be necessary to make a new sense and perhaps some educative opportunities in times that are dominated by technology and economic values. The pedagogical idea that I realize here is that pedagogy is a kind of space or place of plurality composed by different voices. This means a space in between voices, tensioned by speeches, where poets indirectly have something to say. I agree with Octavio Paz's words when he says poetry is the antidote of the technical work of free market. These sentences reduce the function of poetry in an arriving time. I also defend the idea that education is related with poetry in the sense that both create different spaces to be in touch with the world and different ways of thinking, and as a main characteristic, poetry and education cannot be dominated by our desires. Poetry and education are dominated by the unexpected. After this introduction, I will share as a first point that where this idea comes from, and explain the structure, and the second point, explain the structure of the research project, and a third point, review the concept of poetry or poiesis, and for explain what I mean by dispute of the monopoly of education. And finally, I present some open conclusions about the relationship between poetry and education. So we start with question 1. Where does this idea come from? On one hand, this idea comes from my own experience, my own reading experience, based on authors like Hermann Hesse or Hölderlin, who impressed me by confronting the both between poetry and education. In a few words, both authors explore the idea that educational institutions end up with poetry, and also that in educational institutions there is no place for poetry. These ideas in some way are similar with my personal experience in primary school, high school, or university, where I have not really kept in touch with poetry, and these suggestions made me think about the relationship between poetry and education. On the other hand, when I rose my interest for this topic, I was reading Plato's Republic when in chapters of books 2, 3, and 10, he realized that poetry will be not allowed in his ideal republic. As a consequence, when I finished this reading, I felt really curious about the Platon action against the poets, and I tried to understand this position. As second point, I tried to present how the research project is structured. And then my research project has 4 sections and I have 4 sections.
Can you speak slower now?
Okay.
Because it's very tough for me. I don't know what else.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this. Okay, the first section contains the presentation of the project, research question, objectives, and methodology. This is so briefly and really quickly. The second section concentrates on the approach of the concept of poiesis and pedagogy, and the third section explains the study of poetry and pedagogy in classical Greece, and also it shows an analysis of the pedagogical positions of several authors. And finally, I present some conclusions in the fourth section. This is a resume just of the thoughts. Now for this presentation, I present briefly the first section on the project, and after that, I will focus on the Asian concept of poiesis, and I try to explain what I mean with the dispute of the monopoly of education, to make a general idea that of what I'm developing. My research questions are the following. I made 5 questions, just try to focus my subject in this field. And then, why did Plato say that poetry is not good for citizens' education? This is, well, it's a simple question, but was the first one, and then, what is the relationship between poetry and education in classical Greek period, and what is happening nowadays? Where does the hostility against the poets' education come from? And what are the changes in pedagogical sense provoked by the quarrel between philosophy and poetry? And which pedagogical possibilities could be extracted from the relationship between poetry and education? The objectives of the research are contribute to the understanding of the relationship between poetry and pedagogy in classical Greece and nowadays, a study of the different theories of education that were developed during the classical Greece, a study the development of poetry concept and the relationship between poetry of several authors during the 5 and 4 centuries before Christ, explore the pedagogical possibilities of the study of the relationship between poetry and education. As a methodology of research, I consider historical analysis and interpretation of the text. After this, I'm going to focus on the concept of poetry and what other means could have it. And my interest in this section is focused on analysis the development of the concept of poetry, and I will focus more on the context of classical Greek period, where poetry and education were nearest than nowadays. In this period, the concept of poiesis was developed from the meaning of do or make to signify imitation of the reality. Then, what does poetry means? Readings of the word poetry could be done in different ways, but as a general analysis, we can distinguish between 2 main interpretations. On one hand, a modern meaning of poetry. On the other hand, an ancient meaning of the concept of poiesis or poetry, as we know. I will focus on the ancient meaning of poiesis, but also could be necessary to make a reference of what the common meaning of poetry is nowadays. Modern language dictionary often defines poetry as a certain art of language, which normally is expressed by rhyme, normally in verse, and also they often say that poetry could be catalogued, depends of the way of expression. Then we can talk about different types of poetry, lyric, dramatic, epic, and bucolic. And in addition, they say that could be possible to perceive poetry in a text or inclusive in a landscape. Then phrases like this text is plenty of poetry are possible. On the other hand, in a Greek language, poiesis, poetry, come from verbo poieus verb. In English language, they have also the verb poeticize, but this verb reduces the meaning of action that poet does, make poetic something. In contrast with Greek language, the verb poieo has the meaning of do or make. In fact, all the other words, poiesis or poema, comes from this verb poieo. Then, to approach at what those poiesis means, is in classical Greek period, we also have to observe the development of poieos verb. Following the work of Professor Emilio Lledó and Philosophical Dictionary Ferrater Mora, it's possible to identify 3 crucial moments on the development of the verb poieo, which is related with poiesis work. Professor Lledó suggests that during these 3 crucial moments on the development of the verb poieo, we will arrive at the modern concept of poetry. In the first crucial moment, we find that poieo verb, as a general rule, is translated as do or make. The first 2 uses of verb poieo are located on Homer and Hesiod works. In Homer literature, as Professor Lledó shows, has this meaning or do, produce, or will. The main characteristic in Homer is that poieo refers to do or make something material, often handmade. On the other hand, in Hesiod works, the meaning of poieo is related with create, bring into the existence.
Was that the first? So the bring into existence is also related to the first one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the making of something as bringing into existence.
Then at the beginning of the classical Greek period, it's possible to identify an intellectual abstraction of poieo verb through the concept of poiesis. Professor Lledó explains that this intellectual abstraction appears at the first time with Herodotus. Also, Professor Lledó explains that with the emergence of the suffixes sis and ma, the meaning of poieo was moved quickly to signify create or represent something or someone artistically. Consequently, the meaning of poieo as something that you do or make was moved to create something with words. So, what is created is the poem, is poema, and therefore the act of creation is poetry, poiesis. Both suffixes are important because ma represents the result of the action, is poema, is an object, and the object that action produced, the poem, as an object. And the suffix sis represents the action, to be more specific, a whole action to create an object. It's important to know, on one hand, that the ancient meaning of poiesis indicates other meaning or aspect that the modern concept of poetry doesn't consider. The concept of poiesis also indicates a certain art of language to create something with words, which is considered at the modern dictionaries. But also poiesis means an action, a way to do, make or create objects. Nevertheless, this object, as also happened with poems, cannot be previously known. Poiesis is not a fixed idea of the object and his materialization. As a third moment, in the last 2 parts, we realize the idea that poiesis, on one hand, means a certain act of language, and on the other hand, also indicates an action, a way to do, make or create objects. In this third crucial moment, we find a conception of poiesis which is changed totally and represents a new way to understand it. Plato and Aristotle have an important role in this conception. Poiesis into Plato's and Aristotle's point of view is perceived as imitation of the reality. It's widely known that Plato confronts the poetic tradition, but his position toward poetry is really complex for one reason. Plato's attacks toward the poets are disseminated in whole works and with really different comments about the role of poetry into the polis and the period that Plato often refers. Nevertheless, his critics are clear in one point. In this way, it's possible to say that Plato understands poetry as mimesis, as imitation of the reality. But also it's necessary to note that poetry, as mimesis, just could be understood in the Platon's theory of ideas. This means into a world where it is possible to know the ethos or the idea of the things. Following this idea, all human actions, either craftsmen, poets, politicians, or philosophers, are nothing more than attempts to approach that idea, could be of the beautiful or justice. In this point of view, some human actions can be perceived as more valid than another's. Then it's possible to say that poetry wisdom from Platon's point of view is understood as representation of the reality. Into the world are different kind of objects that could be represented. Furthermore, also there are poets who can represent wrong or take in a bad way the object that they want to represent. Thus, this kind of mimetic poets are whom Plato wants to banish in his ideal republic. He argues that they are 3 times far away of the truth, and also that the poets are not developing a good political role into the community or city-state. In a few words, Plato tries to put poetry under the control of philosophy. Aristotle follows Platon's ideas toward poetic tradition, and his time apparently the conflict between poetry and philosophy was resolved. Philosophy appears almost in Aristotle's poetic work as a new and superior medium to transmit knowledge in a great cultural space. Also for Aristotle, poets like too much. In this point of view, where poetry is considered as imitation of the reality, it is necessary that poets not influence into the spirit of the polis. Plato found his critics toward the poets into the 2 main reasons. On one hand, Plato argues that the poets don't have technique or art to transmit knowledge, and also they are enthusiasms by the divine forms, which is the origin of the poetry activity. Following this idea, it's possible to say that Plato, with his new definition of poetry, wants to discredit the poetic tradition, which operates as an educational model. Then we will move to a 4th point. And then in this point I will try to explain what I will be talking about when I refer to the dispute of the monopoly of education. I think the main idea of what I understand with the dispute of monopoly of education is that approximately at the mid of 5th century before Christ, 2 different educational ideas were strongly confronted. This dispute in certain way defined the background where concepts as education and pedagogy were born. In these disputes of the monopoly of education, this study focused on the relationship of authors like Aristophanes, Protagoras, Plato, and Socrates with poetry. This means that in these authors we can find what was the dispute and that time, and sometimes there are no songs so far away that could perceive nowadays. As a general view, it's possible to distinguish between 3 different positions about poetry, and this position in certain way show different educative ideas or pedagogical models. Also, we can perceive that there are some more moderate positions than others. In my opinion, the most clear example that it was disputed at the time could be shown by Aristophanes, a poet who realized the idea that education has to recover the ancient values. This means that Aristophanes strongly agreed with the educational idea focused on the cool of the body and the sporting lifestyle. Then, also it's clear that he opposite the new intellectual education represents by sophists as Protagoras and also Socrates. In this way, a quote of Aristophanes could be shown the way of the dispute. Aristophanes has a book, The Clothes, and it's like a really clear when he comes from like two different discourses about like the new education, new intellectual education, and the Asian education. Also, he defends the aristocratic values because all the ideal of the education of the poets were based on the aristocratic values too, and the imitation of the hero. And at the time in the 5th century, they are also like an ideal of physical education because was the way to imitate this ideal of the hero. And then this is a part of the justice discourse or speech. Yet, certainly shall you spend your time in the gymnastic schools, sleek and blooming, not chattering in the marketplace, rude jest, like the Jones of the present day, not dragged into the court of a pretty sweet, greedy, pettifogging knavish. But you shall descend to the academy and run races beneath the sacred olives along with some modest comfort, crowned with the white wreaths, redolent of dew, and careless ease. At the last shedding with poplar, regocijing in the season of spring, when the plain tree whispers to the elm. It's difficult language for me. The idea of the pool of the body was a pedagogic model which represents a kind of monopoly education dominated by poets. The pedagogical models of the poets, in other words, are more physics and artistic than intellectual. On the other side of the poetic tradition, we find Plato who seriously opposed at the teaching of the poets. Plato also criticized tragedy and comedy tradition. Plato confronts the poetic tradition with what was a kind of education monopoly to change the way to be educated. This change, in a few words, consists in the introduction of an intellectual education under the idea that both arts and politic thoughts must be subordinated to philosophy. That is the idea of the philosopher king who has to be on the top of his ideal republic. On a pedagogical point of view, Plato's attacks toward the poetic tradition just makes sense under the point of view that which is discussed in a certain kind of monopoly of citizen education. Actually, he doesn't discuss the pedagogic possibilities of poetry. Plato discusses the idea that philosophy has to be in a privileged place as a medium of knowledge. Also, Plato made a lot of quotes about the comics and tragic poets, and also to the sophists. And then one of them is, "What do you mean? Why between ourselves you will not betray me to the tragic poets and other imitators? That kind of art seems to be corruption of the mind of a listeners what not possess, as antidote and knowledge of its real nature." In the middle of this strength, we find figures than a sophist. Both Aristophanes and Plato discuss his teachings and his educational positions. In Protagoras, it's possible to perceive that he is more moderate than Aristophanes and Plato in his attitude toward the poetic tradition. Protagoras said, "Of a man, education is to be skilled in matter of verse, that is, to be able to apprehend in the utterance of the poets what has been rightly and what wrongly composed, and to know how to distinguish them and account for them when questioned." I will try to show like this exposition because I think so that the monopoly of education means like a different speech that try to, I don't know, to fight or something like to have a power in the way to be educated. And then I think that pedagogy maybe could be more close at the sophist position, because with this quote of that is a track from Plato Protagoras, but also some they say that this is from Protagoras, and they are open to listen the tradition and try to transform the tradition, but to be critics, no? And also I think so that from Plato's point of view, he tries to transform really in another way the tradition that he was living. And also it's important the context, because on that time was the Peloponnesian War, and then at the time at Plato's time and Socrates' time, they were in a really crisis and tried to recover the situation or something. And then I'm finished with this. And then for me, some open conclusions, some more questions. I think so that the disposal of monopoly of education represents a metaphorical battle between different educational ideas that they were confronted to influence into the spirit of the polis. These disputes, in my point of view, constitute the background where concepts as pedagogy and education were born. I think so the Platon action against the poets represent an effort to change the ancient concept of paideia, which was dominated by the poetic tradition. The relationship between poetry and pedagogy in a classical Greek period was nearest than we can perceive nowadays. And we also perceive one may change in a pedagogical model that physical education was changing to more intellectual education. And in my opinion, poetry and education has something to do in the sense that both represents another way of thinking and another way to do. And also poetry can be understood as certain art of language to express yourself and try to make new sense, to keep in touch with the world.
So, and in this quote you say they are opposed.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so but maybe we should have a look, because there are some words I don't understand from the English translation. So, yet certainly shall you spend your time in gymnastic schools, sleek and blooming. I don't know.
Yeah, I know this quote, but from
properly,
proud.
yeah, like with a proper and elegant styles.
Elegant style. Not chattering in the okay, not chattering in the marketplace with jests, not the use of the present day. And not drinking to court for a little suit. Grooving, okay. Pettifog. What is pettifogging?
Like senseless mongering.
Senseless.
Yeah.
Knavish.
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 Shakespeare-ish. Very knavish. Look it up. Knavish.
But when you say
So for me it's still not, for me it's not really clear what is the difference, what the difference is between these two traditions that you want to distinguish.
uh-huh.
So I'm still looking for the, so you say it's a physic and intellectual,
Mm-hmm.
but and then it seems as if the poets are the physic ones.
Mm-hmm.
And the intellectual not so. But could you try to explain a little bit more this relation between the physic and the poets, or what?
I think
At
so
first
that,
sight, it seems strange to make that connection.
I think so that the distinction is no, maybe it's not really accurate, but I think so that that you can, maybe you can make like a distinction between poets, sophists and philosophers in the way that if we distinguish between three different periods, like at the tragedy times, then sophism and philosophy, and with the ideal of the tragic education was more to build this idea of human, no? And this imitation of the hero, and then we're more based on the
Imitation of the hero.
Of the hero.
Yeah.
We're more based on the cool of the body than the intellectual But
But how you relate that? Why do you relate that to poetry? So the imitation of the hero is related to the poetry.
yeah,
And are you saying that because in those days poetry is mostly used to portray heroes and you said the aristocracy?
yeah, yeah.
So to portray values that fit more into the school of the body?
Yeah, and also because there were like a Pinga too, and he tries to because I think so that the discussion is between is it possible to learn something because well the conflict is between nomos and physis, no? And see something is going like for by nature and it's like aristocratic value, no? It's just the thing is like that and it's impossible to change. And the position of the sophists or the intellectual education, new intellectual education, when I say new intellectual education, I relate more with the sophists because they try to do something by accord or by what I can say, by agreement. And this is the notion of the nomos. This is something that you could create with agreements of the society. And so poets, Aristophanes, they defend the aristocratic values because they try to record the past, how was the ideal of education.
So, but this is your, because you said also you wanted to relate it to today.
Uh-huh.
So is that then, do you plea for kind of aristocratic education?
No, I think so that because the value of poetry maybe was there another way, but I think so that when the poetry was moved to the more in the leisure time and the literary activities was I think so that the meaning of poetry today could be like make sense in a different way that defends the aristocratic values. But when I refer that the poetry tradition, because also you have like the tragedy too, and then I don't put here, but there is a movement of the concept of poiesis, and we start with the skill, and it's more like a mythical education, and just try to transmit the myths from the past. And Sophocles is like the poets of the peaceful years in Athens with Pericles, and he tries to build like an ideal of man through the Sophocles. And also I think so that the most interesting position is the Euripides, Protagoras, because they are more like try to look what is happening today and what is the reality, and they try to question the reality. And then for me, I started with poetry, but I think so that the position of the education could be more related with this kind of, I don't know, teachers or philosophers that Euripides, Protagoras.
With the sophists.
and
Not
Sophocles.
with the poets.
Not to the poets. But also the poets is like not really clear that they are poets or they are philosophers or they are teachers. And then it's
Perhaps an interesting analysis to confront your own ideas with is the first work of very sorry Giorgio Agamben, who used to be a poet himself and then he learned that well and then he became a philosopher. so in the first chapter of the book, The Man Without Content, he also discusses well, the reasons behind Plato's the problems that Plato had with poetry. And most of the times, indeed, we are inclined to think, well, this is because poetry is a bad form of philosophy. It gives a bad representation of reality, therefore we should banish it from our ideal city. But what Agamben claims is that there's a more fundamental reason, and this goes back to what you said about the three phases in the development of the meaning of poiesis, and that somehow Plato still had a very accurate feeling for the original meaning of the word poiesis or poieo, and that it is really to make something new, to bring something new to existence, and this is very dangerous. And so it's not that Plato was against, or Plato himself was also an artist in his beginning years. So he really had still that sense of what it might mean to be productive, to generate something new, and this was very, very dangerous. And therefore he banished the poets from the city. And you could link it to another, I found very interesting, so to bring it to today, very interesting analysis by, again, I'm sorry, Stefan, Zizek, you might know him, who says a similar thing about science fiction. Perhaps you can confirm whether or not it's true that science fiction in China is forbidden. So the genre of science fiction is, there's a law against science fiction. Perhaps it's not true, but the example he gives is very interesting. In the sense that we don't bother anymore about science fiction. We have become so sarcastic that we just accept capitalism and we don't believe that anything can change anymore. But in China, they still have to forbid it, so to speak, because it's still dangerous there to use your imagination and to imagine a completely different world, because it might raise in people the desire for something completely different or new. But we in the West, we have become so desensitized. Yeah. But perhaps that might also be interesting.
Yeah, for me it's more closer than you say, because it's true that the problem with Plato is that he wants to make like a closed republic, you know, and he says like you have to do just one paper into the role of the state, you know, and all that. And also, I think so that poetry is something that can bring something new to the existence, you know, and try to create a new sense of what happens today, you know, nowadays. And I think so that no example, but the question that I have, for example, was that with the experience of Athens, was when I arrived to the Acropolis, was like this was like a real idea past, and was like a kind of fantasy, you know. And then, but the place that when I came was like so real, and but at the same way was like so empty, and then was like no possibilities there, or no looks like some possibilities could be done in that time. And then I was thinking that if education, what could be do education in these places between the fantasy of, or I don't say, to idealize the past, and what's happened with this empty, I don't know, I don't want to say society, but in some way it's like that, no? And then I think so that poetry maybe is not useful, but maybe could be help to create another ways to think, another ways to do. And also I agree with the Octavio Paz word, because poetry is something that is nowadays is not could be useful for the market, and in some ways a kind of free place to do or to be to, and I don't know.
But then you really mean poetry as an specific art of language,
Yeah.
very specific form, like the thing you have at the wall there, which is, even if you don't understand Dutch, you can immediately see that's a problem. Good move.
And actually, I was impressed that on my school and my experience as a student is like a no place for poetry, no? And when it's a place of poetry, it's just to be like a so boring because it's like just to when in Mexico we are like a so nationalist, and then we organize on Mondays in the morning like homenage at the
Homage?
homenage.
A hymn, a homage.
Yeah. For the- and then you
The flag.
you do poetry, but you have to learn all the like for 1 month, and you have to go in front of everybody and say that. And then I just try to relate this.
The discussion that we've had so far is about poetry as kind of a medium to create knowledge. And so the critic actually is that you can't use it to create, because then it cuts itself loose from reality, it mimics. But you also mentioned that it could be used as a medium to transfer knowledge. And to me, these are two separate things. Because you could consider, for example, poetry as being not able to create, but if you use it to transfer a message, it could, from a pedagogical point of view, it could induce change in how people think, because it could pinpoint some critical events from reality that people could start focusing on. And I just wondered whether that transfer issue is been taken along in your discourse on how to use it in a pedagogical setting, not as a medium to create, but as a medium to transfer what we have created or what we have researched or what our content is. Is that part of your storyline somewhere, that difference? Or?
I think I didn't catch everything, but could you?
There's two different things that you put in your talk. One is poets are not suitable to create because they mimic reality. It's not the real thing. But you also said poetry can be used as a medium to transfer knowledge. Then we're no longer on the level of creating, but then we're on the level of what we have created. Can we use poetry to kind of bridge with our target groups and convey a message? And is it potentially useful there, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think so that this could be useful in this way. And also I think that the position of protagonist is really interesting, because they say something that Hannah Arendt says too, that you have to hear the past, or you have to know the past to try to transform and play with the words that you receive. And then I think that with poetry is the same way, because you hear something that was come from the reality of from kind of reality, and you take inside and you try to make kind of sense with this, and then I think so is a good pedagogical instrument to transform the knowledge. I don't know if you mean something like that.
Yeah, it didn't quite capture the nuance in your answer, but I had the feeling that the problem or the critic that you mentioned had to do with something that got lost in translation somehow. That's what you're pleading for. If you use poetry, then something gets lost and you define it as a part of reality that gets lost. But I'm trying to provoke you to think about what you potentially gain from using poetry. Don't focus too much on what gets lost, but also if you use it in a pedagogical context, what do we potentially gain from it? That's what I'm trying to get you. And you might gain connectedness anyway.
Mm.
Because reality is so complex that people sometimes need metaphors to get a
Mhm.
grasp of reality. It helps them, in a sense.
Just to pick up on that, I mean, but for example, Plato himself used metaphor,
Yeah.
but not poetry.
Mm.
So when he spoke about the three classes and the three parts of the soul, it's, so he
Yeah.
uses metaphors there to assign each one of us his or her place in the state. But that's not poetry, so it's different. But anyway.
Yeah, but it does use, it does use metaphors very often. I mean, that's what I get out of it. It just positions, through language, it positions reality. To me, it presents it as a metaphor that I could easily connect with than the real thing sometimes.
Do you think that education in some senses has a revolutionary potential? Because it's a space where new things can begin?
Yeah.
And do you think that poetry has that same potential? Is that a link that you also made? Or?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. Because it's a space where you can create something new, and education is the same. I think it's working the same way. No? Because I think so that education is, for me, is like you can think something, you can do something intentionally, but never happens that what you expect. And then I think so when you write poetry, it's the same way. You can have an idea and you can try to for yourself to do it. But I think so when you finish, also with the text, I think so, it's transformed in another way. And then I think so that in this idea is related with poetry education. That is not like I just, when I went to say, I did. And that's it.
So if there are no more questions, thank you, Raul,
Thank you.
for your presentation.
Thank you.